Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another New Jersey Constitutional Republicans virtual conversation. It's my great pleasure to once again have my good friend, dear Dr. Murray Sabrin. Doctor, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, JR. Greetings from Southwest Florida, where the sun shines and the thunderstorms are fierce.
Well, you've recently, since our last broadcast, Doctor, we did that when you were still up in New Jersey. Now, of course, you're a Floridian. How does it feel to be a Floridian?
Well, it's nice to not have to pay a state income tax and to have consistent weather every day. So those are two high points so far living down here, and everything is close by where we are. We're 10 miles literally from every shopping area that we need to go to, and all the shopping that we had in northern New Jersey is available here. So we're pleased to be down here. We have a nice, comfortable 3-bedroom apartment, and we haven't gone to the swimming pool yet. We've been unpacking and running errands for 3 weeks. Exactly 3 weeks today, we moved into the apartment. So as they say, it's Rome wasn't built in a day. It's an apartment doesn't get taken into its full speed right away. But I just spoke to a former colleague of mine who's been down here for 2 years, and she said they're still unpacking. So some people it takes a while to get settled in, but we're getting there. We should be basically settled in by the end of the month when we have some more furniture coming, and then well, I have another book to write, so I'll be writing from now till the end of March when the book is due. So then I'll take a nice break between books, because this will be my third book in 4 years. So it's a lot of books to write in 4 years. So I'm looking forward to a little respite and hopefully get a lot of speaking engagements. I'm going out to Dallas next month to do a book signing for my Universal Medical Care book.
And we're looking forward to that book. We'll be discussing that in September. And Doc, before we get started, I just want to say that I'm happy you're down in Florida because it gives me one more excuse to get down to Florida to visit you and to enjoy the wonderful weather in Florida, which I do miss. I was a Tampa resident for 3 years back in the early and mid 90s, and really enjoyed my time down there. Of course, I was in the golf profession at that time and worked at some of the one of the best resorts in the world at Innisbrook in Tarpon Springs, and also worked at Cheval Country Club in North Tampa, Lutz, Florida, actually, and had great experiences down there. And of course, now the Tampa Bay Lightning, who I had a great relationship with when they started, are now in the Stanley Cup, and they're 2 games into winning another Stanley Cup consecutively. Nice. So I'm very proud of the Tampa Bay Lightning and the area of Tampa. Of course, it's grown up to a much greater degree than I would even recognize at this point.
Yeah, the growth.
But anyway, speaking of, go ahead.
No, the growth here has been phenomenal. They're building condos all over the place. It just seems like every single day there seems to be a new development popping up. So this area has become attractive. We are literally 5-10 minutes away from the airport, which really makes it convenient if you want to go up, visit New Jersey, or go to Dallas like I'm going, or even they even have international flights. So we're situated in a good place, and we're right off the interstate as well. We're a mile from the interstate. So we're enjoying it, and hopefully it'll continue. And the main thing now is to stay healthy, because that's the key at this stage in life, any stage in life, but it's particularly this stage in life. You really want to be have as optimal health as possible.
No question, Doctor. And I think you and your wife, you both look great, and hopefully you have plenty of happy and healthy years down in Florida.
Thank you so much.
Anyway, Doctor, let's get to this book.
Sure.
Let me share a screen. I want to show everybody this book that they're going to want to go out and get. And the one that we're talking about today is one that is 2 years old this month, Doctor. And it's called Why the Federal Reserve Sucks. It causes inflation, recession, bubbles, and enriches the 1%. And I thought it was interesting, Doc, in reading the book, we usually think of the word sucks as being a metaphor for bad.
Yeah.
But I also saw that it really has two meanings. It does that the Federal Reserve can be considered bad also, but it does literally suck. And as far as monetary policy and interest rates and all of the different actions that the Federal Reserve incorporates in trying to micromanage, if you will, or macro manage an economy, literally sucks a lot of the ability of the economy and the free market to basically conduct its own business without any interference. So it sucks a lot of the life out of the economy.
Right. I mean, one of the things that it's hard to know is exactly how large and how prosperous the economy would be if the Federal Reserve didn't try to micromanage it, as you point out, and didn't manipulate interest rates, which is basically their fundamental tool called the Fed funds rate, where they pump money into the banking system, pump money out to try to keep interest rates at a certain level. And as we know, in the free market, prices have to reflect supply and demand, not intervention by government or a government-created institution like the Federal Reserve. So that's one of the major criticisms of the Federal Reserve, is that it tries to act like a central planner. And this is something that the mainstream economists don't appreciate or understand, that central planning doesn't work and central banking doesn't work either, even though some people think that you need central banking in order to, quote, stabilize the economy. That's why the Federal Reserve was created in the first place, ostensibly to, quote, stabilize the economy after the panic of 1907. And so the evidence of the Fed's activities for the past 100+ years has been nothing short of disastrous. And so that's what I discuss in the book in a chronological order until we get to the creation of the Federal Reserve. So fire away with your questions and we'll go from there.
Right. And if you'll see, we have this is listed up as it's on Amazon, and it's a worthy $19 spent. You're going to get much more out of the book. It's really well done. And I'm so happy that you're able to discuss the book with us, Doctor. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about this book. Primarily, we're going to go through half of the book today. And then in August, we'll go through the second half of the book, because there's a tremendous amount of information. There's quite a bit that I'd like to touch on. But one of the quotes that you say, and try to bring this out a little further, Doc, you'll say that on page 12, thus the Federal Reserve has what every American wishes it had, an unlimited checking account. The U.S. Congress created the Federal Reserve in 1913 to stabilize the economy after the panic of 1907. The Fed was sold, quote unquote, to the American people as a measure to rein in the banks for their reckless behavior and enormous power over the economy. And this is how you start the book, essentially.
Well, the interesting thing is, and I would urge all the listeners to go watch Murray Rothbard's 1984 presentation on the creation of the Federal Reserve, where he names the names of the people in and outside of Congress and Wall Street who were instrumental at that infamous secret meeting off the coast of Georgia at Jekyll Island, that where they basically put together the blueprint for the Federal Reserve, and they sold the idea to the American people as an anti-bank bill, when in fact the bankers helped write the bill, because the bankers, and this is one of the most important points about the book and free market economics in general. Bankers, or the banking system, operates under a flawed structure, namely fractional reserve banking. In other words, the banks don't have all the money it says it does to meet depositors' demands. And that's why they were called bank runs and bank panics in the 19th century, because when people got nervous about the solvency of a bank, they went in and tried to get their gold out or silver out, and the banks didn't have it because they loaned it out. So they took the money in the front door, loaned it out the back door, so to speak. And that was the structure of the banking system throughout American history, and it still is the structure, but there were banking panics because you had to redeem the paper money into specie, which is gold and silver. And so I go into that discussion in the book, and I think it's important to realize that most economists, virtually all economists, except the Austrian school economists, who provided me with a lot of rich detail in my research. They're the ones that criticize fractional reserve banking, while most economists, most Wall Street people, virtually all politicians say that fractional reserve banking is normal and necessary for banks to operate. But we know from the consequences of fractional reserve banking that it's an unstable system. And so the Federal Reserve was created as a lender of last resort in order to prop up the fractional reserve banking system. And I think that's one of the major themes of the book, is that without central banking, you couldn't get fractional reserve banking to be sustainable. And therefore, they keep on inflating. And we saw in the last 30 years, the banking problems we've had in this country, and the government, the Federal Reserve, comes to the rescue with bailing out the banks. But having said that, this goes throughout American history. Rothbard wrote his doctoral dissertation at Columbia University in the 1950s on the Panic of 1819, where he goes through detail of how the banking system and what was unsustainable, and it led to this tremendous panic. And guess what is one of the reasons that the banking system becomes more unsustainable and more volatile is because of war, the War of 1812. The government had to borrow money, and it borrowed money from the banks, and the banks created the money to help the government pay off its debts to fight the war. So there is an integral link between war and inflation and banking. And that's another theme of the book, is that war cannot occur without a central bank, because the government taxing the people would find it very hard for the people to pay all the taxes necessary to sustain a military campaign. And the government couldn't raise the money by just issuing debt, because there's probably not enough savings for that to happen. So central banking and war, which is an important theme of American history and world history, is an important lesson for all of us, that throughout the Vietnam War, Johnson wanted cheap money, and the Federal Reserve provided that in order for him to float, not only to conduct the war, but also pay for the Great Society program. So that's when we got the real welfare warfare state in the post-World War II period. The Johnson policies, which were unsustainable both on the fiscal end, the military end, and of course the monetary end.
Doctor, let me ask you a question for the people that may not know. Explain what fractionalized banking is. What does the fraction mean? The modifier fraction before the banking mean?
Okay, if you put $1 in a bank, in a checking account, you don't expect the bank to lend that money out. So that would be 100% reserve banking. The bank has exactly the money that was put in by people for safekeeping. In other words, the bullion. And then banks would issue banknotes drawn on a particular bank. Now, if they issued more paper than they had bullion in the bank, that would be fractional reserve. So if a bank issued 50% more paper than bullion that they had, that would be a 50% reserve. And then eventually it went down to 10%. So the banks were very shaky when they only had 10 cents on the dollar of bullion to back up all the paper notes they had outstanding. And then as as people spent the money and the money went into another bank, you'd get a multiplier effect. So every dollar that was created by a bank would have, on a 10% fractional reserve, would eventually become $10, and that would inflate the money supply, giving you price inflation. So that's one of the dangers of fractional reserve banking. It leads to price inflation, even if you didn't have a central bank, because you had a lot of price inflation in the 19th century under fractional reserve banking without a central bank. But there were attempts to create central banks, the first bank of the United States, the second bank of the United States, and then the National Banking Act in the second half of the 19th century. So under 100% reserves, which is what Rothbard and other Austrian economists argue for, is that you do not get the distortions that you have when the banks only keep a portion of their deposits on reserve and they lend out the rest in order to, quote, earn interest, because they loan money out to earn interest. And therefore, banks get a windfall because they're lending out make-believe money that they just printed up to lend out under the regime that we had in the 19th century. And of course, today we have under fiat money, where the banks are not required to keep bullion, but they do keep cash in reserves. So we've gone from a bullion reserve gold standard to a fiat money, digital currency, if you will, because basically all our money is digital, if you will, or electronic. So so that's the difference between 100% reserves and fractional reserve banking.
Very good. And let's continue, Doctor, to set the historical precedent and foundation for this. We can go back to that rivalry between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Of course, Hamilton was a proponent of a central bank. Jefferson was not. It was under, and of course, the War of 1812, many of the critics against not having the central bank was that the Madison and the government was not prepared for the War of 1812 because there wasn't a bank already established. But then again, we had the second bank go through, and of course, the rivalry between Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson lasted up until the rivalry was taken over by Andrew Jackson, who represented the Jeffersonians, and Henry Clay, who represented the Whigs and the Alexander Hamilton. So this was 50 years into our nation. This argument over a central bank was very prevalent, right?
Well, this is the historical backdrop to the bank issue, which was, by the way, even though people weren't very educated formally in the 19th century, they were very interested in banking issues because they saw the value of their money going down with fractional reserve banking and this first and second bank in the United States literally printing up money to bail out the banks and to this was part of the crony capitalism that De Lorenzo talks about in his book on Hamilton, Hamilton's Curse, I think it's called. And so he points out that this is the difference between the decentralist of the Jeffersonians and the nationalist of the Federalist and then the Whigs. So again, this is fascinating historical ideas or events that take you through the journey of how money and banking has evolved. And one of the important points I want to make, which is a theme, I think, throughout American history, despite all the interventions by the central banks, the first bank, the second bank, and now the Federal Reserve, the US economy has grown enormously from 1800 to the present. That's the amazing thing. And that shows you the spirit of entrepreneurship, innovation, creativity that's sort of innate in the American people, because as Buffett points out, you look at the standard of living in 1800 and the standard of living today, it's unbelievable given the technological advances. So between the inventors, the innovators, and the entrepreneurs, we've had a very successful journey in the economy, but we've had glitches along the way, the different banking panics of the 19th century, the Great Depression, which set back the country enormously, the Civil War, which set back the country enormously in terms of the economic development of the South. So when government intervenes in the economy, no matter how it intervenes, the entrepreneurship does not go away. It just continues. One of my favorite books, which I have somewhere, I'm looking for it right now. It's on my shelf. It's called They Made America, something like that. Sort of a biography of all the great entrepreneurs up until the early part of the 20th century. And these are remarkable people, whether it's in the food industry, the transportation, the medical industry. These are people that are curious. They want to know how to improve people's lives. And they have done a remarkable job in making goods and services available to the vast majority of people at affordable prices. Even with the inflation that we've had over the past half century, the average person can buy a computer and buy a cell phone, which were at one time only available to wealthy people. And now the average person can get a cell phone and call anywhere in the world for basically free. You have a computer that allows you to access information for free. And so these are the great technological advances that we've seen in this century, plus the medical advances that have been just unbelievable, from laser surgery.
And Doc, Doc, I'm showing the first graph in your book that shows the growth of economy since the founding of the nation, which has just gone continually up, despite all of the interventions and so forth. So that point that you're making is well displayed here in this first chart within the book. So
I think it's just a great story about the country, is that despite all the things that government does in terms of intervening, which they think is good for the economy, but it's counterproductive. That's a term I like to use. The government policies, as good as intention as they may be, will give people the benefit of the doubt. They're counterproductive. They don't achieve the results they say they're going to achieve. And then you can make the other argument that they're really doing things to feather their own nest. That's the corporate capitalism argument, that this is people who know what they're doing, and they're using the government like Hamilton did to benefit his cronies. And that's what DiLorenzo points out in his book on Hamilton's curse, that Hamilton was basically tied into the financial elites of the country, and he was using the government with protectionism and banking to enrich people at the expense of the public. And that's another major theme of the book, is that government is not neutral when it comes to its policies. There are winners and losers when it comes to government. And it's only the free market that creates winners, all winners. There are no losers in a free market. Everyone benefits who works or has a business, because you have to satisfy consumer needs. And when you do that, you get rewarded, called a paycheck or profits.
Doc, let me read a portion of the book as we continue here in the early stages of the book. This is quoted from page 23, and you say, quote, "Before we evaluate the banking sector and the reoccurrence of banking panics amid our country's first 100 years plus prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve, a review of the fundamentals of money and banking will provide a backdrop to understanding how, after more than a century, the Federal Reserve still has not accomplished its mission of fostering, quote, stability, unquote, not only in the banking and financial sectors, but also of general economy.
Yeah.
In addition, one of the primary reasons for the creation of the Federal Reserve was to preserve the purchasing power of the dollar. Yet from 1914 to the present, February 2017, the US dollar has lost approximately 95% of its purchasing power. And you also have a figure in figure 4 showing that. And the question is why? Why the dollar has been devaluated?
Well, the money has been pouring out from the Federal Reserve. Their balance sheet was going up steadily. And of course, in the last 2 years, because of the implosion of the economy, because of the lockdowns from COVID, the Federal Reserve has just gone haywire. I think they increased their balance sheet, namely how much new money they've printed is about $3 to $4 trillion, which is unprecedented in American history. That they've literally opened up the monetary spigot, and we're now seeing it in inflation, commodity prices, housing prices are going crazy in certain communities. Right. In fact, there was an article. I still get the Bergen Record on an e-edition, and they had a chart the other day of housing prices year to year from last spring to this spring. Some communities, prices are up 20, 30%. That's not a normal market. Prices do not go up 20, 30% on the quote naturally. It's because of tremendous money being created. And of course, interest rates being lower than they otherwise would be, that gives an incentive for home buyers to purchase homes, and gives banks to lend money, because they turn around and sell those mortgages to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And the federal government is buying up all these mortgage-backed securities at the tune of $50 billion a month. So the dollar's purchasing power has gone down. But again, to reiterate my previous point, the economy still has grown, but some people have been left behind. The people who have the marginal skills, the low-income workers, the minimum wage workers, their living costs go up and their salaries don't go up as much at all, because they don't have the skills. So again, the best anti-poverty program is not the Great Society of Johnson and other presidents, but to get a skill or a couple of skills that will allow you to be attractive in the workplace. And as I used to tell my students when I was teaching finance, that was my 5th career since I graduated college, because although I don't have a finance degree, I developed skills along the way, which allowed me to teach finance, even though my PhD is in economic geography, which is about inflation, which is ironically enough. And so I use those skills to parlay that into a teaching position, teaching finance. And so
Right.
if students have
Doc,
skills, you can get work today very easily.
right, Doc, let's give another definition too to the people that, a lot of people hear the word inflation, but they
Yeah.
really don't know what it means.
Yeah.
It has to do with rising prices, correct?
Well, this is the interesting thing. That's the general accepted definition of inflation, that it's rising prices. But rising prices is the consequence of inflating the money supply. So Rothbard, in his work, points out that inflation historically has meant an increase in the money supply that is based upon printing money by the banks or the central bank. So inflation is really an increase in the money supply, not covered by specie, as Rothbard points out. And then the consequence of that is price inflation and an unsustainable boom in the economy. So we have to be very careful about our definitions, that inflation is the price inflation is the consequence of monetary inflation.
Right. And the other way we can think of it, Doc, too, as far as the printing of money, the endless printing of money, if you had only so many Mickey Mantle rookie cards, they're going to be worth they're going to be worth more than if you printed thousands and thousands and thousands of those cards. And that's the same. We can apply that same thinking to our dollars, correct? The less dollars that exist, the more valuable they are, correct?
Well, here's the way I like to describe it. Let's say you go to a farm to get a gallon of milk, and you get 100% milk, and it's $1, to make it easier to calculate. And then you go back a few days later, and the farmer puts in 90% milk and 10% water, but he still charges you $1. So you've now paid 10% more for the milk, actually 11% more, because you've gotten only 90% milk thereabouts. So you got 90% milk and 10% water, and you're still paying $1. So your purchasing power of the dollar is only giving you 90% milk for the gallon instead of 100%. So that's what the Federal Reserve does. It creates money, which eventually devalues or lowers the purchasing power of that unit, those extra units that are created. And here's another important theme of the book. In a free market economy, the natural tendency of prices is to gently fall. And we've seen this over my lifetime, your lifetime, of prices that have fallen, like computers, like high definition television and other things, that because of tremendous productivity gains. In fact, when I was a youngster in the 1950s, when color TV came out, and I just a preteen, and they were very expensive, I said, intuitively, I said to myself, why buy a TV, a color TV when it comes out? Because over time, there'll be more production and prices will come down. And that's exactly what happens with high definition TVs. TVs that we bought several years ago are probably 30, 40% lower than they were 3-4 years ago. And the quality is better. That is how the benefits of a free market economy reaches everyone. And that's another important lesson about monetary economics.
And we would understand that as being, with the prices falling, that's what we would identify as deflation, correct?
See, there's good deflation. That would be an example of that. And then we had the bad deflation from 1929 to 32, when the money supply shrank after being inflated in the 1920s, and you had a collapse in the economy under Hoover. Unfortunately, he was the scapegoat for the inflation and deflation that took place in the late 20s and early 30s. But he was an interventionist. Hoover was not a conservative Republican. He was basically a precursor to Roosevelt. He was an interventionist through and through. When he was Commerce Secretary prior to being president, he wanted to intervene during the 1921 Forgotten Depression. And Harding and Coolidge told him, well, Harding, who was president at the time, said, basically, I'm not going to take your advice. And of course, the depression, the Forgotten Depression, healed itself without any stimulus from the federal government or anything like that. So we have a case study of two depressions: the post-World War I depression and then the post-stock market crash depression, and both were handled differently. And one lasted 18 months, and the other one lasted a decade. So tell me which policies were better: the hands-off policy or an interventionist policy of Hoover and Roosevelt.
Right. And the Federal Reserve, Doctor, was created to mitigate against what essentially occurred with the Great Depression, did it not? The Federal Reserve was created to avoid that sort of a depression, that sort of deflation, and it was enabled to. And of course, Hoover gets a lot of the blame for it because in many ways he was very Keynesian, and we'll talk about Keynesian versus Austrian too. But the Federal Reserve was created to mitigate or to keep a Great Depression from happening, was it not?
Well, that's the whole. They were given three mandates. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913: keep prices stable, smooth out the business cycle, and be a lender of last resort. And being a lender of last resort has become one of their primary objectives throughout its history. They've been lending money to banks in trouble. Sometimes they let banks go and banks get taken over, but certainly it hasn't made the business cycle more smooth, given that we had a decade-full depression a few years after the Federal Reserve was created. Then we had the Forgotten Depression, as I mentioned, after World War I. And the purchasing power of the dollar.
Doctor, let me ask you this now.
Sure.
So the first mandate was to regulate pricing, which would be done through a central bank. Now, you and I, who believe in free markets, we believe that the market, that the consumer and the producer are the ones that should be giving us wage and price controls through the natural conduct of the free market, correct?
Well, yeah, that's it. I mean, prices will fluctuate according to supply and demand. This is economics 101. Right. So we don't need an institution to address higher prices or lower prices. In fact, next month, as you know, is the 50th anniversary of Nixon closing the gold window, and the dollar has lost, I think, 60% of its value or more since then. So again, when you don't have an anchor to,
Doctor, let me stop you right there. Explain to the people why that was so important and so detrimental. The founders understood money as being specie, hard metals, that which would not depreciate over time, that would still maintain value. And then, of course, we got into paper. And supposedly the gold and the specie was always backing the paper. Right. But then that was separated completely. So explain to the people why that was had such a disastrous effect.
Well, ironically, the American colonists fought the revolution against the British when and to do that, the Continental Congress printed up a ton of money. And that's where the term "not worth a continental" comes from, because they printed an extraordinary amount of money, and the Continental became virtually worthless. The states piled up debts. And so when the Constitutional Convention was put together, they put in the clause that nothing but gold and silver should be money. And of course, that has been ignored for the past 100 years plus so, since the Federal Reserve kept a managed gold standard, a gold exchange standard, if you will, rather than having a full gold standard that Rothbard and other.
And why is that bad, Doc? Doctor, explain to people why that's bad.
Well, it means that the banks and the central bank can create money out of thin air. They can just inflate the supply of money. There's no straitjacket, if you will, on creating money. In other words, money comes naturally from the earth. Gold was chosen as money, not by arbitrary whims of governments, but the people chose gold and silver because of their rarity, this relative scarcity. You don't make stones money because you'd be burdened to carry money around because of the huge supply of stones. So the market chose, in other words, people through their trial and error chose gold because of all the things, the qualities of gold. It's high value per unit, it's homogeneous, it's divisible, it's durable, all the things that you learn in basic economics of why something becomes money. In other words, paper doesn't have the qualities that gold and silver have because paper can be destroyed. People are probably wearing gold chains and rings that may have been mined hundreds of years ago because gold can be recycled. It's a valuable commodity. In fact, when computers are dumped one of the things that people do is they take the gold and silver out of the computers because there's some gold and silver there. So if you have a lot of computers that are in the dumpsters in third world countries, they go and harvest the precious metals and other components that have value. So you need to restrain the supply. And what restrains the supply is the relative scarcity that the earth provides. In other words, if gold was abundant, it wouldn't be money. It would be something that would be less abundant. And that's the beauty of what money is. It has to be relatively scarce.
Right. Now explain what Nixon did back in '71 when he separated the gold standard from the paper money entirely. Why that was such a detrimental.
Yeah, that's a long history, but basically he just ended the Bretton Woods system that was created in 1944 to create a post-war monetary system where the dollar would be a reserve currency valued at $35 an ounce, which Roosevelt devalued the dollar from $20 an ounce, 1/20th of an ounce to $1 to a 1/35th. So that was from 1944 to 1971. So that's 27 years. The dollar was the reserve currency. It still is the reserve currency, but as a fiat currency. And because of the Great Society that started in 1965 with the Vietnam War, the US government was spending money it didn't have. It ran up huge deficits at the time. The Federal Reserve was monetizing, printing money to help pay for these spending. And the dollars were piling up overseas. And so the foreign governments and central banks had the right under the Bretton Woods Agreement to take their dollars and present it to the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, to get the to get 1 ounce for every $35. And so the United States started the end of World War II with $25 billion worth of gold at $35 an ounce. By 1965, 67, it only had $9 billion because the French and other governments were redeeming their dollars for gold because they saw that the US dollar was being devalued with the ceaseless printing. And so it's a lot of detail in the book, but basically this was inevitable. As Henry Hazlitt pointed out, when he was writing for the New York Times, he was writing against the Bretton Woods Agreement, saying that this was unsustainable. And what does unsustainable mean? It means that it's eventually going to end. And it did end in 1971. It took a while, but Hazlitt was the lone voice in America, basically saying that this system will not be sustainable because it's based upon a flawed premise that the US can still inflate and try to maintain the dollar at $35 an ounce. So the whole thing collapsed on August 15th, 1971. And we've been in the fiat money world ever since then. And we've had all these financial crises periodically with the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, and now what some people call the everything bubble. So, so this decade could be a decade of reckoning. We'll just have to see how it plays itself out. I've always said, when I first started learning about this 50 years ago, I said the key to the reserve status of the dollar is how foreigners view the dollar. If they start dumping US treasuries, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Europeans, the Arab, OPEC nations, if they start dumping the dollar because they don't want to hold a depreciating currency or hold government treasury securities, that's when it's checkmate for the US government. And the US government will then have to get its fiscal house in order, which will be painful because I just read the other day that the deficit for this year is going to be $3 trillion because of Biden's spending. That's an enormous deficit when it wasn't too long ago. The whole budget was less than $3 trillion. Now we're running deficits of what the whole budget used to be. So again, here's an example of fiscal and monetary policy working in cahoots that eventually destabilizes the economy. So right now we're in the sweet spot. The stock market's at an all-time high. The jobs are plentiful. Prices are going up. The question is, how high will they go up over the next several years? Are we going to see a late 1970s stagflation eventually in the United States, which is a real possibility of high inflation and rising unemployment? So again, every period in monetary history, business history is unique, but we do have the tools to analyze it. And right now, the Federal Reserve has thrown caution to the wind by keeping interest rates well below the rate of inflation, and that really gooses the economy. So we'll just see how this plays out. But again, no matter what happens, There'll be new products this year, the following year afterwards, and that will improve people's living standards. But the question is, will people's incomes be keeping pace with inflation? And typically the average person's income doesn't keep pace with inflation. And that's why they feel it at the gas pump, they feel it at the supermarket, they feel it when they pay their utility bills. And I just read something this today. 76 million Americans are living paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
That's it. That's a terrible indictment of our of government policy, that people are living paycheck to paycheck.
Right. I do want to mention too, in the book, Doctor, you talk about John Kenneth Galbraith and his book, Money, Whence It Came, Where It Went. And he says, quote, "The historical association between money and metal is more than close for all practical purposes. For most of time, money has been more or less precious metal," which of course what you've been talking about, and how the gold and the silver and copper and other precious metals never lose value and are always in demand. And it was important for the precious metals to be backing up the notes. And of course that all ended with Nixon. But I also think it's interesting, Doctor, in the book that you talk about Milton Friedman, and he's very revered amongst most conservatives, with a lot of what he wrote and what he said and what he taught. But I was surprised that he appears to be more on the Keynesian side than we had first thought.
Absolutely. I mean, Friedman was an inflationist. He had this monetary rule, which has no basis in economic theory. I used to read him when I was a college student, his Newsweek columns, and it made sense to me as an uninitiated undergraduate that if you grow the money supply 3% and the economy grows 3%, then prices should be stable. That's a macro view that is incorrect, because we know prices go down.
Yeah.
Productivity increases in certain sectors and prices will naturally go down. So to keep, quote, the price level stable, he picked that up from Irving Fisher, the famous economist from Yale University in the 1920s, who predicted or felt that the 1920s was a great period because prices were flat. Well, prices should have been falling because the money supply was increasing, and the tremendous productivity of the 1920s should have lowered prices throughout the decade. Instead, they kept prices level, except the stock market and real estate prices went through the roof in the 1920s, was showing where the spread of new money was in the economy. In other words, money goes to sectors that will benefit from the new money, and that in the 20s was real estate and the stock market. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Irving Fisher said, well, if we keep the price level stable, everything's going to be great. And just before the market crashed in October 29, he famously said, the stock market has reached a permanent high plateau just before the market crashed. And he was heavily invested, and he lost, I think, all his wife's money in the crash of 29. So he was discredited. And then Friedman picked up the torch in the 1950s, calling for the price rule, that prices should be stable, when in fact we know in a free market economy, prices will be falling gently. And he just, I think, misinterpreted money. And one of the best early books about this, by the way, which listeners can read, available free at the Mises.org website, is Carl Menger's 1871 book, The Principles of Economics, where he goes into the history of how money evolves in society. And I took some of his ideas and incorporated it in my book, because it's an important lesson about economics, is that money is not an arbitrary artifact of civilization. There's a rationale to money, and that is because people needed a medium of exchange to make transactions, especially over distance. And would have a generally,
Now, let me ask you a question. Let me ask you two questions. Number one, do you think that Menger's book was the foundation for the Austrian school? And then give the people a quick synopsis of the difference between the Austrian school and the Keynesian school.
Yeah, Carl Menger was the founder of the Austrian school with his book, The Principles of Economics. That began the marginal revolution. Other economists at the same time came up with the same concept, that we shouldn't think in terms of macro, of whole units, but at the margin. One of the most important developments in the history of economic thought, that we think in terms of marginal analysis. which helps you understand how the world works, how people behave in the marketplace. And so the Austrians take a very basic view of the human condition. Say, value is subjective. It's based upon people's preferences on their value scale of what they want to give up in order to obtain what they want. So the example I use in the classroom, whether it's with elementary school students or college students, is when you buy a slice of pizza for $2, you express your preference for the pizza instead of the $2, while the pizza maker expresses his preference for the $2 instead of the pizza. And so he can make a profit by selling the pizza for $2, and you get satisfaction by buying the pizza for $2, which you're willing to give up in order to satisfy your hunger needs. So we do that with every product and service that we buy. What are we willing to give up to satisfy our wants and needs? And that's exactly how the world works. Right. That was the breakthrough of the Austrian school, while the Keynesians have this notion that everything is demand driven. And therefore, when there's insufficient demand, the government has to come in and print money and deficit spend to prop up the economy, which is such a distorted view of the economy. And the great Henry Hazlitt refuted all that in his book, The Failure of the New Economics, which is available free at the Mises website, where he goes chapter by chapter and refutes Keynes in his 1959 book, The Failure of the New Economics, I think, or The Failure of Keynesian Economics. And in fact, if you go to the Mises.org website, you can get his 1946 classic Economics in One Lesson for free. So we don't need Bernie Sanders to get us free stuff. The Mises.org website
highly recommended.
Oh, it is one of the most important books of the 20th century.
Yes, that's a must. One that I want to read, and we could have a whole show on that book.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Mises.org is a tremendous, highly recommended resource for all things Austrian school. And of course, that's what constitutional Republicans are more geared towards in thinking as far as economic policies. But Doctor, before we wrap up, I want to talk about the book. You go into great lengths in explaining and talking about Dr. Greenspan, the Fed chair, appointed by Ronald Reagan. I always thought he was a brilliant man. He's obviously a brilliant man. But I think you go through, you really present a lot of the different speeches that he gave, where there was a lot of questioning that it really wasn't a perfect science, what he was doing. And also the fact that he changed really from an Austrian school thinker with his 1966 essay. He became more Keynesian as he served as the federal chairman of the Fed, and how that change all took place. And he actually became more and more, and he didn't see some of the bubbles that were coming up and some of not the depressions, but rather what's before the depression? Not the depression.
The panics.
Regression.
The panics.
Yeah, the panics, as they were historically called. Depression, not depressions, but not as bad. But he didn't see a lot of these things, and it was almost as if he kind of questioned himself as he went along on what the very principles of the Fed were supposed to be incorporating and micromanaging, if you will, the economy.
Well, there have been several books written about Greenspan, highly critical. Rothbard was very critical of Greenspan. Greenspan's 1966 essay, Golden Economic Freedom, which I first read in 1969. And former Congressman Ron Paul, when he was on the House Banking Committee, had Greenspan autograph that essay, because Greenspan basically took a hard money approach. Namely, when central banks inflate, they cause all sorts of problems. They cause.
Doc, just let me say, it's recession was the word I was looking for. Recessions. Right. And interestingly enough, and I want you to continue on, also, same thing with Chairman Bernanke. He seemed to be very, very Austrian school motivated. As he became the Fed chair, he moved over to more of a Keynesian point of view.
Well, Greenspan, some people consider him an opportunist, first being chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Gerald Ford in 1974. Then he went back into private practice, and then he was tapped by Reagan to become Fed chairman in 1987, in June of 87. And then a few months later, we get the stock market crash of 1987, where the market declined 22% in one day. And what did he do? He inflated. He gave us the dot-com bubble throughout the 90s. And he just kept on inflating away. There's a book by Fleckenstein, which I quote in my book, the Age of Ignorance, about Greenspan. And Fleckenstein, who's a money manager on the West Coast, really does a widespread critique of Greenspan's policies. And there are other books about Greenspan as well that he should have known that what he was doing was going to cause problems. And because he wrote about this since 1966, that once you have fiat money, once you have central bank printing money, you're going to create the boom bust cycle. And so he understood that. And yet he perpetuated that as Fed chairman throughout his 19-year tenure from 87 to, I guess it was 2006 when Bernanke took over. And he just perpetuated that and gave us the housing bubble. And then, as I say, we've been on this roller coaster for a long time, but it seems that the downward slope of that roller coaster is getting steeper and steeper. And that's what should concern us all.
Well, Doctor, it's been a great first part in looking at your book here. The book is Why the Federal Reserve Sucks. You're going to want to, there's two meanings to that word sucks, as we described earlier. And it's a great first start to part one of this. We'll do part two next month, Doc. I really appreciate your participation with this and teaching. And I think all the audience, I hope they'll share and like this video and get the information out. Economics can be a little intimidating to most people, but Dr. Sabrin makes it very simple. And we hope that we're helping the public and educating them on economics and why the Federal Reserve really works in contradictory to a healthy free market.
Well, that's it. The central banking is the antithesis of the free market. I mean, central planning doesn't work, central economic decision doesn't work, and therefore central banking doesn't work, because free market banking would protect everybody, and it would make the bankers more fiscally responsible and conservative in their dealings with the public and corporations. So the evidence is there. We have the historical evidence, we have the theoretical evidence. It's just a matter of people demanding that. And that's really what it comes down to.
Great. Thank you, Doctor, for joining me again. And we'll see you next month. And we'll go do part two of this great book that we're looking at. I appreciate you writing the book. And thank you very much for joining us. Please like and share the video. And remember, as we sign off, what Lincoln said, liberty for all. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, and happy 4th, everyone.
Happy 4th of July to everyone, and we'll see you next month with Dr. Sabrin.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.